The Clyde estuary on August 2, 1942, looked like the graveyard of empires. Fog rolled across gray water where 14 merchant ships wallowed at anchor, their hulls pregnant with cargo that would decide whether Malta lived or died, whether Rommel marched into Cairo or rotted in the desert, whether the Mediterranean remained contested or became an Axis lake. The ships bore prosaic names: Melbourne Star, Port Chalmers, Clan Ferguson, names that should have appeared in Lloyd's Register and then vanished into the anonymous catalogue of maritime commerce. But history was about to make them immortal. Among these vessels sat one that would become legend, though nothing in her appearance suggested destiny. The SS Ohio, an American-built tanker of 9,264 gross register tons, looked precisely like what she was: a floating bomb. Her tanks held 11,500 tons of kerosene and diesel fuel, enough to keep Malta's Spitfires flying for 2 months, enough explosive potential to vaporize a square mile of ocean if a torpedo found her. She was, in the cold arithmetic of naval warfare, expendable. But her cargo was not. Without Ohio's fuel, Malta would fall by September. With it, the island would endure. And if Malta endured, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps would starve in the desert, its tanks immobilized, its Stukas grounded, its artillery silent for lack of shells. The fulcrum of the North African campaign wasn't at El Alamein. It was riding at anchor in Scotland, disguised as a merchant tanker. Captain Dudley William Mason, aged 40, master of the SS Ohio, understood this with the clarity that comes from watching too many ships die. He'd spent 2 years running convoys through waters where German submarines hunted like wolf packs and Luftwaffe bombers turned the sea into a forest of waterspouts. The mathematics of Malta convoy duty were merciless and exact. Operations Harpoon and Vigorous in June had dispatched 17 merchant ships toward the besieged island. 2 arrived. The tanker Kentucky, carrying the aviation fuel Malta desperately needed, had been obliterated by German bombs, her crew vaporized, her cargo feeding a fire that burned on the water for 3 days. Now Ohio carried that burden. The only tanker in a convoy that would transit 400 miles of water dominated by Axis airfields on Sicily, Sardinia, and Pantelleria. 400 miles beneath bombers that could reach the convoy in 20 minutes. 400 miles through submarine patrol zones where Italian and German U-boats waited in ambush. 400 miles past minefields laid specifically to tear open the hulls of ships exactly like Ohio. Mason assembled his crew in the petty officers' mess that afternoon, 77 men who represented every corner of Britain's maritime empire. Merchant seamen from Liverpool and Glasgow who'd survived the Battle of the Atlantic. Royal Navy gunners barely old enough to shave. Royal Artillery anti-aircraft specialists who'd seen what 88mm flak did to bomber formations and were now tasked with defending a floating ammunition dump with 20mm Oerlikons and prayers. The captain stood before them without notes, without theatrics, his voice carrying the flat honesty of a man delivering a medical diagnosis. "We sail this afternoon. Destination: Malta." He let the silence that followed expand until it filled the compartment. Every man present knew what Malta meant. Malta meant running a gauntlet through the most heavily defended waters in the world. Malta meant Stukas diving out of the sun while you stood on a deck full of high-octane fuel. Malta meant German torpedoes and Italian motorboats and minefields, and 400 miles of ocean where the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica owned the sky. "Ohio is the only tanker in the convoy," Mason continued, his voice unchanged, delivering catastrophe in bureaucratic prose. "We shall be fighting our way through with 11,500 tons of kerosene and diesel fuel in our holds. I want every man to understand what that means. We're not carrying steel or grain or ammunition. We're carrying the most explosive cargo it's possible to transport. 1 torpedo, 1 bomb, One incendiary round in the wrong location and Ohio will cease to exist. So will everyone aboard her. He paused, letting them visualize it. The flash, the expanding fireball, the ship vaporizing in a blast that would be visible from Sicily. Death so instantaneous they wouldn't have time to scream. I am offering every man the choice to go ashore, right now. No questions asked, no consequences, except that you'll be held in naval custody until the operation concludes. Security is essential, but if you stay, understand what you're accepting. Based on the results of the last 2 Malta convoys, the odds suggest 2 out of 3 ships won't make it. Those are the statistics. That's the reality. The compartment was silent. Outside, gulls cried over the Clyde. Somewhere distant, a ship's whistle sounded. Inside the mess, 77 men contemplated mortality with the strange calm of those who'd already accepted they were probably going to die. Not one man moved toward the door. Mason held up a letter from the Admiralty, its official seal catching the dim electric light. His voice shifted, taking on the cadence of official language, the bureaucratic poetry of men trying to express gratitude while ordering others to probable death. Before you start on this operation, the First Sea Lord and I are anxious that you should know how grateful the Board of Admiralty are to you for undertaking this difficult task. The hazards of this voyage are manifest. We are confident that with your skill, determination, and courage, you will succeed. The safety of Malta, and with it the course of the North African campaign, depends upon your success. He folded the letter, placed it carefully in his pocket, and looked at his crew with eyes that had seen too much ocean and too many burning ships. Gentlemen, we sail at 1600 hours. Man your stations. They filed out in silence, these 77 men who'd just volunteered for a suicide mission because a starving island 2,000 miles away needed fuel, and someone had to deliver it. History would remember 5 of their names. The rest would become statistics in an after-action report. But every man who walked out of that mess hall that afternoon made the same calculation. Malta was worth dying for. The war was worth dying for. And if Ohio was going to run that gauntlet, they were going to run it with her. The naval force assembled around those 14 merchant ships represented British sea power stripped to its skeleton and reassembled as a fist. Force F, the operation was designated in the cold language of Admiralty planning documents, but the name captured none of its desperation or scale. This wasn't a convoy. This was the entire home fleet condensed, the Royal Navy's capital ship strength in the European theater, gambling everything on one throw of the dice. 2 battleships formed the armored core, HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, floating fortresses mounting 9 16-inch guns apiece, weapons that could hurl a 1-ton shell 23 miles and obliterate any Italian cruiser that dared close with the convoy. Their presence sent an unmistakable message to the Regia Marina. Approach at your peril. Come for these merchant ships and we will sink your fleet. 3 aircraft carriers provided the aerial shield, a concentration of carrier power unprecedented in British convoy operations. HMS Eagle, the eldest, converted from a Chilean battleship hull during the First World War, carried 16 Sea Hurricanes. HMS Victorious, one of the new Illustrious-class armored carriers, embarked 16 Fulmars, 6 Sea Hurricanes, and 12 Albacore torpedo bombers. HMS Indomitable, another illustrious class, carried 10 Martlets, 24 Sea Hurricanes, and 16 Albacores. Between them, 72 fighters and 28 strike aircraft, more carrier aviation than the Royal Navy had deployed in any single operation since Taranto. 7 cruisers screened the flanks and provided anti-aircraft fire, the heavy cruisers Manchester, Nigeria, and Kenya, their 6-inch guns capable of engaging both surface targets and high-altitude bombers. The anti-aircraft cruisers Cairo, Charybdis, Phoebe, and Sirius, purpose-built to throw up walls of steel against dive bombers, their multiple pom-pom and Oerlikon batteries designed specifically for the kind of aerial assault everyone knew was coming. 32 destroyers formed the convoy's close escort, the workhorses of fleet defense, fast enough to hunt submarines, maneuverable enough to intercept torpedo boats, armed with enough depth charges and torpedoes to make any U-boat captain think twice before pressing an attack. Ships with names like Fury and Foresight, Ledbury and Penn, Laforie and Lookout. Tribal-class destroyers with their distinctive profiles. Hunt-class escorts designed for exactly this kind of close-in defensive work. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In the summer of 1941, when Malta's offensive capability peaked, British forces were sinking 75% of Axis shipping bound for North Africa. 3 out of every 4 ships carrying fuel, ammunition, and supplies to Rommel's Africa Corps never reached port. German divisions sat idle in Tripoli because their tanks had no fuel. Italian infantry went hungry because supply ships burned in the Mediterranean instead of unloading in Benghazi. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding the Africa Corps, understood Malta's strategic value with the clarity of a commander watching his logistics collapse. In May 1941, he wrote to German High Command, "Without Malta, the Axis will end by losing control of North Africa." The warning was prophetic. A year later, Rommel's offensives stalled not from British resistance, but from supply shortages. His tanks ran out of fuel within sight of Alexandria because the tankers carrying that fuel were burning hulks in the Mediterranean, sunk by Malta-based aircraft and submarines. The Axis response was inevitable and overwhelming. If Malta couldn't be taken by invasion, and after the savage losses in Crete, neither Hitler nor Mussolini had appetite for another airborne assault, then Malta would be bombed into submission, starved into surrender, pounded by aerial assault until its defenses collapsed and its population could no longer endure. The siege that followed was industrial warfare at its most pitiless. Between January and July 1942, there was exactly one 24-hour period without bombs falling on Malta. One day of respite in 7 months of continuous assault. The Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps II and the Italian Regia Aeronautica flew 3,000 sorties against the island during this period, dropping more ordnance per square mile than fell on London during the entire Blitz. The bombing achieved its tactical objectives. By August 1942, Malta's offensive capability had been effectively neutralized. The submarine flotilla relocated to Alexandria because Malta's harbors were too damaged to service them. RAF bomber squadrons sat grounded, their aircraft either destroyed on the airfields or lacking fuel to fly. Fighter squadrons defending the island were down to perhaps 60 operational Spitfires, flying constant patrols that burned through fuel reserves with terrifying speed. But the bombing failed to break the population. The Maltese endured with a stoicism that bordered on the supernatural. They lived in bomb shelters carved into the island's limestone, entire families spending nights in caves while the earth shook from explosions overhead. They survived on rations that barely sustained life, 1,500 calories per day, half what a human being needs for normal activity, a quarter of what manual laborers require. Disease followed hunger like a shadow. Scabies became endemic, spreading through overcrowded shelters where sanitation was primitive and privacy non-existent. Dysentery, typhoid, and tuberculosis flourished. Medical supplies dwindled to nothing. There was no morphine for the wounded, no anesthetics for surgery. Doctors operated on kitchen tables using instruments boiled in seawater because there was no fresh water to spare for sterilization. The island's infrastructure collapsed under the bombing. Water mains shattered, forcing people to queue for hours at the few functioning wells. The electrical grid failed. Sewage systems backed up, spreading contamination through neighborhoods that had survived since medieval times. Buildings that had withstood sieges by the Ottoman Empire in 1565 crumbled under German high explosive in 1942. Yet Malta refused to surrender. When King George VI awarded the island the George Cross on April 15, 1942, the citation captured something that military reports couldn't quantify. "To honor her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history." It was the only time in British history that an entire population received the nation's highest civilian honor for bravery. The George Cross would be incorporated into Malta's flag, a permanent reminder that this island had endured what should have been unendurable. But medals couldn't fuel Spitfires. Citations couldn't load anti-aircraft magazines. Awards couldn't feed 250,000 people slowly starving to death. By August 1942, Malta had 3 weeks of supplies remaining. The RAF commander reported aviation fuel sufficient for 10 days of combat operations. After that, the Spitfires would be grounded, the anti-aircraft guns would fall silent, and Malta would be defenseless. And beneath the surface, 7 British submarines prowled ahead of the convoy, positioned to ambush the ambushers. Safari and Unbroken off Milazzo and Palermo, United and P-222 between Malta and Tunisia, P-31, P-34, P-46, forming a picket line where Italian submarines were expected to wait. Utmost somewhere in the darkness, hunting. The scale of Force F revealed the stakes with mathematical precision. An Arctic convoy, PQ-19, had been cancelled outright, its escorts stripped away and reassigned to Pedestal. The home fleet sat in Scapa Flow at reduced readiness, battleships and carriers pulled south to cover this single convoy. The entire British naval posture in European waters had been reorganized around getting 14 merchant ships to Malta. The Admiralty's operational calculus was brutally simple. Without Malta, Rommel's supply situation improved dramatically. Axis convoys to Libya would sail unmolested, delivering the tanks and fuel and ammunition that sustained the Africa Corps. With adequate supply, Rommel could take Alexandria, could take the Suez Canal, could open the route to Middle Eastern oil fields that fueled Britain's entire war effort. But with Malta operational, with its Spitfires and submarines and torpedo bombers striking at every Axis convoy, Rommel would starve. His tanks would run dry. His artillery would fall silent. His infantry would go hungry while British forces built up for a counteroffensive that would drive him back across the desert. Malta was the pivot. Malta was the linchpin. And Malta needed fuel. The strategic geography was unforgiving. Malta sat 58 miles south of Sicily, close enough that German fighters could patrol over the island for 20 minutes before having to return to base. Close enough that bomber formations could strike the island, return to Sicily, rearm, refuel, and strike again in the same day. Far enough from friendly bases that convoy operations required transiting 900 miles of contested water from Gibraltar, or 715 miles from Alexandria through even more heavily defended approaches. The island was effectively under siege, besieged not by armies but by geography and air power. Between June 1940 and August 1942, Malta had endured 3,000 air raids. More bombs per square mile than London during the Blitz. More sustained aerial assault than any location in human history. The civilian population was on starvation rations. The garrison was down to weeks of ammunition. The RAF squadrons defending the island had fuel for perhaps 10 more days of combat operations. And Operation Pedestal had to deliver enough supplies to sustain Malta through the autumn, enough ammunition to keep the anti-aircraft guns firing, enough food to keep 250,000 people alive, and above all, enough fuel to keep the Spitfires flying. Because without the Spitfires, Malta was defenseless, and defenseless Malta was dead Malta. Force F represented the largest single naval commitment Britain had made to any convoy operation of the war, larger than the Arctic convoys to Murmansk, larger than the troop convoys that had carried armies to Africa and the Middle East. 50 ships total, 14 merchants, and 36 warships, concentrated in a tactical formation designed to fight its way through 400 miles of Axis-dominated water. The convoy that steamed south from the Clyde on August 3, 1942, carried the fate of Malta in its holds. But it also carried something less tangible and more vital: proof that Britain refused to abandon its people, that besieged garrisons would not be left to starve, that the Mediterranean would remain contested regardless of the cost. The Axis powers understood the stakes as clearly as the British, and they were preparing a reception. To understand why Britain committed such overwhelming force to save one island, one must understand what Malta represented in the geometry of Mediterranean warfare. This wasn't sentiment. This wasn't Churchill's romantic attachment to imperial strongholds. This was cold, strategic mathematics, the kind of calculation that wins or loses campaigns. Malta occupied the choke point of the Mediterranean, positioned like a knife blade pressed against the throat of Axis supply routes to North Africa. From its airfields at Lucca, Hal Far, and Kali, RAF bombers could reach every major port in Libya and Tunisia. From its harbors, submarines of the 10th Flotilla hunted with devastating effectiveness, their captains legendary for aggressive tactics that sent Italian merchantmen to the bottom with monotonous regularity. From its waters, Force K, a surface action group of cruisers and destroyers, sortied to intercept Axis convoys under cover of darkness, appearing out of nowhere to massacre supply ships before vanishing back to Malta's protection. On the morning of August 10th, Force F passed through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. There was no hiding now. Axis reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoy from a distance, counting ships and radioing reports. In the operations rooms of Sicily and Sardinia, Axis commanders studied maps and made their plans. They knew the convoy's destination. They knew its approximate speed, and they knew they had 400 miles to destroy it. Captain Mason stood on Ohio's bridge as the convoy entered the Mediterranean, watching the other merchant ships around him. Melbourne Star, Rochester Castle, Port Chalmers, Brisbane Star, Dorset, Deucalion, Wairangi, Waimarama, Glenorchy, Almeria Likes, Santa Elisa, Empire Hope, Clan Ferguson. 14 ships carrying 85,000 tons of desperately needed supplies: food, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, everything Malta needed to survive and fight. But more than anything, Ohio's fuel. The Spitfires needed Ohio. The submarines needed Ohio. Malta's survival depended on one American-built tanker with a British crew and a captain who knew exactly what was coming. The first day passed with strange calm. A few German reconnaissance planes appeared at high altitude, too distant for the fighters to intercept, observing and reporting. The convoy steamed east at 15 knots, the merchant ships in 4 columns, the escorts screening ahead, on the flanks, and astern. The carriers maneuvered to launch and recover combat air patrols, keeping fighters aloft continuously. Everyone knew it was the calm before the storm. Everyone knew the real battle would begin tomorrow. August 11th, 1942, 1:15 in the afternoon. The Mediterranean glittered under summer sun, the kind of perfect visibility that makes submarine periscopes nearly invisible against the broken surface of the sea. HMS Eagle steamed in formation with the convoy, her flight deck spotted with sea hurricanes ready to launch at moment's notice. Her crew at action stations, watching the sky for the bombers everyone knew would come. They were watching the wrong direction. Kapitan Lieutenant Helmut Rosenbaum, commanding U-73, had achieved what should have been impossible. He'd penetrated the destroyer screen unseen, threading between escorts whose ASDIC operators were listening for exactly this threat. He'd stalked the convoy for hours, patient as death, waiting for the perfect firing position. Now, at 1,200 meters, he had a solution on the largest target in the formation. Rohr eins bis vier, los. 4 torpedoes leapt from U-73's bow tubes, their motors leaving tracks of bubbles on the surface, 4 fingers of death reaching toward Eagle at 30 knots. The submarine dove immediately, crash diving to 80 meters, knowing the destroyers would triangulate on the torpedo tracks and converge on the firing position within minutes. But Rosenbaum had made his shot. Everything else was survival. Eagle's lookout spotted the torpedo tracks 30 seconds before impact. 30 seconds to sound the alarm, to order emergency turns, to brace for what was coming. The carrier, displacing 22,000 tons and making 18 knots, couldn't evade. Carriers don't dodge. They're too big, too heavy, too sluggish to maneuver like destroyers. Eagle's captain ordered hard to port anyway, a futile gesture in the face of physics. All 4 torpedoes struck home. The first hit forward on the port side, blowing a hole 30 feet across in Eagle's elderly hull plating. The second struck amidships, demolishing the port boiler room, killing every man inside instantly. The third and fourth hit aft in quick succession, tearing open the engine spaces, flooding compartments faster than damage control parties could even reach them. Eagle had been converted from a Chilean battleship during the First World War. Her damage control systems designed for a different kind of warfare, inadequate for the massive flooding these torpedo hits created. Water poured into her hull through wounds that would have sunk 3 destroyers. She listed immediately to port, 8 degrees in the first minute, the list accelerating as flooding progressed unchecked. The carrier's captain gave the order to abandon ship 4 minutes after the torpedoes hit. Not because he wanted to, because the mathematics of flooding and buoyancy left no alternative. Eagle was dying, going down by the bow, her list approaching 30 degrees. Men who delayed would be trapped inside when she capsized. Governor General William Dobbie, the man responsible for Malta's defense, sent a cable to London that captured the crisis in clinical terms. It is now a question of weeks, not months. Without substantial supplies reaching us by the end of August, Malta will be forced to capitulate. Capitulate. The word hung in the air at the Admiralty like poison gas. If Malta surrendered, the Mediterranean became an Axis lake. Rommel's supply situation improved overnight. The Africa Corps could be reinforced without impediment. The road to Cairo lay open. The Suez Canal would fall. British access to Middle Eastern oil would be severed. India would be threatened. The entire strategic position in the Middle East and Africa would collapse. All of this, the campaign in Egypt, the war in Africa, the security of the Suez Canal, Britain's access to Middle Eastern oil, the threat to India, all of it hinged on keeping one island supplied. All of it depended on getting fuel to Malta, which meant it all depended on SS Ohio and the 13 other merchant ships assembling in the Clyde estuary. The weight of empires rested on 14 civilian ships, crewed by men who'd volunteered to sail into what everyone acknowledged was probably a death trap. The mathematics were clear. Malta needed 100,000 tons of supplies to survive through autumn. The convoy could carry 85,000 tons if every ship made it through. Historical precedent suggested that perhaps 2 or 3 ships would reach Malta. 2 or 3 ships wouldn't be enough. Malta would fall. Rommel would win. The entire Mediterranean strategy would collapse. But historical precedent assumed normal convoy operations. Operation Pedestal wasn't normal. It was the largest, most heavily escorted convoy operation the Royal Navy had ever mounted. It was Britain committing everything, stripping the home fleet, canceling Arctic convoys, exposing the Atlantic routes to save one island. The Axis powers knew Pedestal was coming. Their reconnaissance aircraft watched Force F assemble. Their submarines shadowed the convoy from the moment it left the Clyde. Their bombers waited on Sicilian airfields, armed and fueled. Pilots briefed on what was approaching. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that among those 14 merchant ships sailed one vessel that would redefine the limits of what ships and men could endure. A tanker that would be torpedoed, bombed, crashed into, and broken in half, yet still deliver its cargo. a ship that would become legend specifically because it refused to become a statistic. SS Ohio was steaming toward immortality. She just didn't know it yet. The convoy steamed south from the Clyde on August 3rd, bound first for Gibraltar, where it would refuel and make final preparations before entering the Mediterranean. The passage down the Atlantic was tense but uneventful. U-boats prowled the Bay of Biscay, and Focke-Wulf Condor bombers ranged far from French bases, but Force F was too powerful to be casually attacked. The submarines watched and reported, and in Rome and Berlin, Axis commanders began to understand that something significant was approaching. Admiral Iachino, commanding the Italian fleet, received orders to prepare for a major interception. Field Marshal Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean, began moving aircraft to Sicily and Sardinia. The Luftwaffe's Flieger Corps II, recovering from savage losses in Russia, assembled 425 aircraft. The Italian Regia Aeronautica contributed another 359 bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. Together, they represented over 780 combat aircraft positioned to attack a convoy that would have to transit directly beneath them. 19 Axis submarines deployed to intercept positions. 9 Italian boats took station north of Algeria. 10 more submarines, both Italian and German, waited between the Fratelli Rocks and the Scherchi Bank, positioned to ambush the convoy as it approached Malta. The Italian Regia Marina deployed minefields across the convoy's expected path, over 11,000 mines laid in overlapping fields between Sicily, Pantelleria, and Tunisia. The Italian surface fleet prepared to sortie with 9 cruisers and 17 destroyers, enough firepower to overwhelm the convoy's close escorts once the aircraft carriers and battleships turned back, which they would have to do before entering the narrow waters east of Tunisia, where Italian shore batteries and minefields made capital ships impossibly vulnerable. The crew abandoned ship with the discipline that comes from drill and training, and the Royal Navy's tradition of doing things properly even when everything is falling apart. They went over the side in orderly fashion, sliding down nets into the Mediterranean, swimming away from the ship that had been their home, watching her die from the water as destroyers raced to pick them up. 8 minutes after the torpedoes struck, HMS Eagle capsized. She rolled to port until her flight deck touched the water, paused for a moment as if reconsidering, then continued rolling until she was completely inverted, floating upside down, her keel pointing at the sky. She hung there for perhaps a minute, this image from a nightmare, a 22,000-ton warship floating hull up like a dead whale. Then she sank, bow first, accelerating as she went, disappearing beneath the surface in a rush of air bubbles and debris and fuel oil. 16 Sea Hurricane fighters still chained to her deck went down with her. So did 131 men who couldn't abandon fast enough, trapped inside when she rolled, drowned in compartments that became coffins, or sucked down in the vortex she created when she finally went under. The destroyers HMS Lafori and HMS Lookout pulled 929 survivors from the water, men coated in fuel oil, many injured from the explosions or the fall into the sea. The rescue operation took 2 hours, 2 hours during which the convoy had to slow, becoming more vulnerable to the submarine and air attacks everyone knew would follow. U-73 escaped. Rosenbaum drove his boat deep and silent, evading the depth charges the destroyers dropped, surviving to return to port and receive the Knight's Cross for sinking an aircraft carrier. It was, from the German perspective, a perfectly executed attack. 1 submarine, 4 torpedoes, 1 carrier sunk. The mathematics of submarine warfare at its most efficient. For the British, Eagle's loss was both tactical and psychological catastrophe. The convoy had lost 25% of its fighter cover before the main battle had begun. The Sea Hurricanes that went down with Eagle represented aircraft Malta desperately needed, pilots who'd trained for this mission, aviation assets that couldn't be replaced. More ominously, the sinking proved that Axis submarines had penetrated the destroyer screen, that the escort wasn't impenetrable, that Ohio and the other merchant ships were vulnerable despite being surrounded by 36 warships. Captain Mason stood on Ohio's bridge watching Eagle's survivors being hauled aboard the destroyers, watching the oil slick spread across the Mediterranean, watching the debris field drift past. He'd seen carriers sunk before. He'd watched ships larger than Ohio vanish in minutes. But Eagle's sinking felt different, felt like an omen, a preview of what the next 4 days would bring. The convoy steamed on. There was no alternative. They couldn't turn back because Eagle was gone. They couldn't stop to mourn or reorganize. The schedule was merciless. Malta was dying. The timetable admitted no delays. At 3 p.m., 2 hours after Eagle went down, the first major air attack developed. 30 Italian SM-79 Sparviero torpedo bombers from Sardinia, 3-engine aircraft carrying 45-centimeter torpedoes, approaching low and fast, their pilots among the best in the Regia Aeronautica, veterans of 2 years of Mediterranean combat. The convoy's guns opened fire, every weapon that could bear throwing steel into the air. The battleship's 5.25-inch anti-aircraft batteries fired on predicted bearings, putting up curtains of explosions the bombers had to fly through. The cruiser's multiple pom-poms created walls of 40-millimeter shells. The destroyer's oerlikons and machine guns fired tracer streams that looked solid enough to walk on. Fighters from Victorious and Indomitable scrambled at the first radar contact, tore into the Italian formation. Martlets and Sea Hurricanes diving from altitude, guns hammering, shredding bombers before they could drop their torpedoes. The SM-79s scattered under the assault, their carefully planned attack disintegrating into individual survival efforts. 2 bombers went down, exploding in midair or cartwheeling into the sea trailing fire. The rest scattered, dropping their torpedoes at extreme range, launching from 2,000 meters where the weapons had minimal chance of hitting, survival trumping accuracy. The torpedoes spread out across the Mediterranean, running on parallel courses through the convoy formation, missing everything, finally running out of fuel and sinking to the bottom. 45-centimeter duds that had killed no one. Ohio steamed through a forest of water columns thrown up by near-miss bombs. Mason stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the German bombers overhead, watching the Italian torpedo planes racing in from the port quarter. He couldn't maneuver. Breaking formation in a coordinated attack was suicide. The escorts knew where each ship should be, where to place their protective fire. A merchant ship that maneuvered independently became isolated, vulnerable, a target separated from the herd. So Ohio held course and speed, and the bombs fell around her. 1 stick straddled the tanker, 6 bombs exploding in a line that sent water cascading over her deck. Shrapnel rattled against the hull, and men instinctively ducked through the bombs had already detonated. Another near miss to port lifted the tanker's bow clear of the water, the shock waves slamming through the hull with a sound like a hammer hitting a gong. But Ohio survived the first attack. In 3 hours of continuous assault, the convoy lost 1 merchant ship, Deucalion, hit by bombs that set her cargo ablaze and forced her abandonment. 1 ship from 14 wasn't bad, not compared to what everyone had expected, but this was just the beginning. The convoy was still 250 miles from Malta. The worst was yet to come. At 6:35 that evening, as the August sun began its descent toward the African coast, the second major attack developed. This time it came from Sicily, 95 aircraft including the dreaded Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, their inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear making them unmistakable, their sirens screaming as they dove nearly vertical onto their targets. The attack was coordinated with brutal efficiency. High-level bombers came in first, forcing the fighters to climb to intercept them. Then the Stukas rolled over into their dives, plummeting down at angles that seemed impossible, releasing their bombs at the last possible moment before pulling out in turns so tight pilots sometimes blacked out from the G-forces. And while the defenders looked up, the torpedo bombers came in low, Italian SM-79s racing toward the convoy at wave-top height, too low for the high-angle weapons to engage them, presenting the most difficult target possible for fighter pilots trying to shoot them down. The carrier Indomitable took 2 direct bomb hits and 3 near misses that lifted her bodily from the water. Fire erupted on her flight deck. Her aviation fuel lines ruptured. For terrible minutes, it seemed she would become another Eagle, another carrier sent to the bottom. But her damage control teams were superb, trained to a standard the elderly Eagle had never achieved. They isolated the fires, contained the flooding, kept her afloat. But Indomitable was out of the fight, unable to launch or recover aircraft, reduced to a floating target that somehow had to be protected while providing nothing in return. The destroyer Foresight took a torpedo in her stern that blew off her rudder and propeller shaft. 2 attempts to take her in tow failed, the stricken destroyer wallowing in the swells, unable to keep station. In the merciless arithmetic of convoy warfare, the decision was made to scuttle her. Depth charges set to minimum depth tore Foresight's keel open, and she went down bow first as destroyers continued to circle, still hunting the submarines everyone knew were nearby. When the attack finally ended after nightfall, the convoy had survived another gauntlet. But survival had been expensive. The air patrols were visibly thinned, fighters expended in the day's battles lost to German Messerschmitt 109s and Italian Machi 202s that were proving far more dangerous than British intelligence had predicted. The anti-aircraft ammunition expenditure had been enormous. The escorts had fired thousands of rounds, and magazines were running low, and now came the most dangerous phase of the entire operation. At midnight, the heavy covering force would turn back. The battleships Nelson and Rodney, the carriers Victorious and Indomitable, the heavy cruisers, all would reverse course and steam for Gibraltar. They couldn't risk capital ships in the Narrows between Sicily and Tunisia, where shore-based artillery, minefields, and shallow water made them impossibly vulnerable. The merchant ships would continue east with only a close escort of cruisers and destroyers. The air cover would be gone. From this point forward, they would be on their own until Malta-based Spitfires could reach them, and that wouldn't happen until they were within 80 miles of the island, 80 miles through waters where Axis submarines waited in ambush, 80 miles beneath Sicilian airfields where Stukas sat fueled and armed, 80 miles past Italian motor torpedo boat bases at Pantelleria, 80 miles that had to be traversed in daylight because the minefields made night passage suicidal. Captain Mason watched the big ships turn away, their wakes phosphorescent in the darkness, and felt utterly alone. Ohio was now screened by 4 cruisers and a dozen destroyers, brave men in capable ships, but it wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough. The Italians were somewhere out there with cruisers and destroyers of their own, waiting for this moment when the convoy was vulnerable. Shortly after midnight, as the heavy covering force faded into the distance, Italian submarines struck. The Regia Marina had positioned its best boats along the convoy's route, and now they attacked with the kind of cold professionalism that British intelligence had consistently underestimated. The cruiser Cairo took a torpedo amidships that broke her keel. She went down in minutes, her crew scrambling into the warm Mediterranean water as destroyers raced to pick them up. The cruiser Nigeria, flagship of Rear Admiral Harold Burrow commanding the close escort, took a torpedo in the bow that killed 53 men and nearly took off her forward turret. The cruiser Kenya was damaged by a near miss that flooded compartments and reduced her speed. But the most ominous hit was the torpedo that struck Ohio. The Italian submarine Axum had penetrated the destroyer screen with consummate skill, getting close enough to fire a spread of torpedoes at the tanker. One struck home amidships, precisely where Ohio's pumps and machinery spaces were located. The explosion was massive, a column of flame that shot 200 feet into the air, visible for miles. Captain Mason felt the tanker shudder beneath his feet, felt the deck plates buckle, heard the shriek of tearing metal. For a terrible moment he thought Ohio was finished, that the torpedo had ignited the fuel, and they were all about to die in a blast that would be seen from Sicily. But the reinforcement work done in Glasgow held. The torpedo had blown a hole 24 feet by 27 feet in the port side of the midships pump room. It had blown another hole in the starboard side, flooding the compartment completely, but the fuel tanks remained intact. The fire was coming from ruptured hydraulic lines and burning kerosene that had leaked from damaged pipes, not from the main cargo. Mason ordered the engines stopped. Every available hand turned to fighting the fires with deck hoses, water pumping from the tanker's fire mains, men in asbestos suits advancing into compartments full of smoke and flame. The burning kerosene bubbled up through fractured tanks, small gouts of fire spattering the deck up to 30 yards from the main blaze. It took 20 minutes to get the fires under control. 20 minutes during which Ohio sat dead in the water, falling behind the convoy, a perfect target for any submarine or aircraft that spotted her. But somehow, impossibly, no follow-up attacks materialized. The crew got the fires out, got auxiliary pumps working, managed to restart the engines at reduced power. The damage was catastrophic. The torpedo had destroyed Ohio's gyro compass and knocked the magnetic compass off its bearings. The steering gear was out of action, forcing the crew to steer manually from the emergency station aft. The midship section was flooding, water rising despite the pumps, the tanker settling lower in the water with each passing hour. But she was making 13 knots, enough to keep station with the damaged convoy, enough to keep moving toward Malta. Mason stood on the bridge as dawn broke on August 13th, watching the sky lighten over Sicily, knowing what the day would bring. The Italians and Germans had hit them hard during the night. Now, in daylight, with the convoy reduced to 4 cruisers and 10 destroyers for escort, with no air cover and hundreds of aircraft within range, the massacre would begin. He was right. At 8 a.m., the first attack developed, Stukas and Ju-88s coming in from the north, dozens of them, their bomb loads visible beneath their wings. The convoy's guns opened fire, and fighters appeared from Malta, blessed Spitfires that had flown out to their maximum range to provide what cover they could. But there were only 8 Spitfires, and they were outnumbered 10-1. The merchant ship Wimarama exploded in a blast that sent debris spinning hundreds of feet into the air. A German bomb had penetrated her magazine, and the ship simply disintegrated, vanishing in a cloud of smoke and flame and vaporized metal. Nothing remained but burning oil on the water and a few pieces of wreckage drifting on the current. The merchant ship Clan Ferguson took 3 direct hits that set her cargo ablaze. Her crew abandoned ship, scrambling down nets into the water as destroyers maneuvered to pick them up. The ship burned for hours, finally sinking in the early afternoon with her back broken. And then the Stukas found Ohio. 6 of them rolled into their dives simultaneously, sirens screaming, diving so steep it seemed they would fly straight into the sea. Captain Mason watched them come, watched the bombs separate from the aircraft, watched them grow larger as they fell. Near misses to port and starboard threw columns of water over the tanker's deck. One bomb struck the forward superstructure in a glancing blow that failed to penetrate but tore away plating and started fires. And then one of the Stukas, hit by anti-aircraft fire, lost control. The pilot was likely already dead, slumped over the controls as his aircraft continued its dive, no longer a bomber, but a 4,000-pound projectile carrying a 500-pound bomb. The Stuka crashed into Ohio's starboard side forward of the bridge, striking just above the waterline. The aircraft's bomb failed to detonate, but the impact was devastating. Half a wing tore through the superstructure. Aviation fuel sprayed across the deck, igniting instantly. Debris showered the entire length of the ship, and for a moment, Mason couldn't see anything through the flames and smoke. Then the smoke cleared enough to reveal the extent of the damage. The Stuka's engine had punched through the hull plating. The aircraft's remains lay smoldering on the foredeck. Fires burned in 3 separate locations. But Ohio was still afloat, still making way, her engines somehow still functioning despite the punishment she'd absorbed. Mason grabbed the voice pipe to the chief engineer. "How's it look down there?" "We're holding together, Captain," came the reply, shouted over the roar of machinery and the screech of damaged bearings. "But we can't take much more of this." They didn't have to wait long. Another wave of Stukas appeared, and this time they bombed with precision. 2 sticks of bombs fell, one on either side of Ohio, lifting the tanker completely out of the water. Mason felt the deck rise beneath his feet, felt weightlessness for an instant. Then the crushing impact as over 9,000 tons of ship crashed back into the sea. The engines stopped. The lights went out. In the sudden silence, broken only by the sound of water rushing into ruptured compartments, Mason knew Ohio was finished. The electric fuel pumps had broken in the concussion. The engines couldn't function without fuel pressure. The ship was making no headway, wallowing in the swells, settling by the bow as water flooded the forward compartments. "Abandon ship," Mason ordered, the words bitter in his mouth. After everything they'd survived, after coming so close, to abandon ship within 100 miles of Malta seemed impossible to accept. But there was no choice. Ohio was sinking beneath them. Better to save the crew now than wait until the ship rolled over. The men scrambled over the side into life rafts and the water where the destroyer Penn maneuvered alongside to pick them up. Mason was the last man off, as tradition and regulations demanded, stepping down into Penn's motor launch as Ohio's bow continued to settle lower, her stern rising as the forward compartments flooded. Penn's captain, Commander John Swain, stood on his bridge wing looking at the wallowing tanker. She was low in the water, burning in several places, her deck awash amidships. But her cargo was intact. The fuel that Malta desperately needed was still in her tanks. Abandoning her meant condemning Malta to starvation and surrender. Swain made a decision that would earn him a Distinguished Service Order and immortalize Penn in naval history. Instead of leaving Ohio to sink, he would attempt to take her in tow. It was technically impossible. The tanker outweighed the destroyer by a factor of 10 to 1. Penn's engines could never move that mass. But Swain didn't care about technically impossible. He cared about Malta, and Malta needed that fuel. A boarding party from Penn scrambled back aboard Ohio with a heavy 10-inch manila hemp tow line. They secured it to the tanker's bollards, and Penn began to pull, her engines straining, her screws churning the water white. Incredibly, impossibly, Ohio began to move. Not fast, barely 3 knots, but she was moving. Captain Mason went back aboard his ship with a skeleton crew, men who volunteered to stay with Ohio despite knowing that every minute aboard increased their chances of dying when the next attack came. They restarted the bilge pumps manually, pumping water out of flooded compartments, fighting to keep the tanker from sinking beneath them. The chief engineer and his black gang worked miracles in the engine room, splicing broken fuel lines, reconnecting severed electrical cables, coaxing damaged systems back to life through sheer willpower and profane determination. And then, hours later, they got the engines restarted. Not at full power, not even at half power, but enough to turn the screws, enough to add Ohio's own propulsion to Penn's towing effort. The tanker's speed increased to 7 knots, then 9. It wasn't fast, but it was movement, and movement meant hope. The convoy had continued east without them. The other merchant ships couldn't wait, couldn't slow down, not with Sicilian aircraft still hunting them. By nightfall on August 13th, 3 more ships had reached Malta: Melbourne Star, Port Chalmers, and Rochester Castle. They entered Grand Harbor to cheering crowds, their cargo immediately beginning to offload under arc lights while Spitfires flew combat air patrol overhead. But Ohio was still 60 miles out, crawling toward safety at walking speed, a wounded animal trying to reach shelter before the wolves found her again. The destroyer Ledbury joined Penn, the 2 destroyers flanking the tanker, providing anti-aircraft fire and moral support if nothing else. A fleet minesweeper, WWII, positioned herself at Ohio's stern, helping to steer the unresponsive tanker. Through the night, they crept eastward, every man aboard expecting torpedoes or aircraft at any moment. The Mediterranean was thick with Axis submarines. Sicilian airfields were less than 100 miles away, and dawn would bring the bombers back. But somehow, through darkness and exhaustion and sheer stubborn refusal to quit, they kept moving. August 14th dawned to find Ohio still afloat, still making way, though barely. Her back was broken, her keel cracked amidships, the hull plates separating. Water had flooded so many compartments that she was down to her plimsoll line, her decks awash, waves breaking over the bow with each swell. But the fuel was still in her tanks. Malta was 40 miles away, and Captain Mason stood on the bridge of his dying ship and refused to let her go. The Brisbane Star, another damaged merchantman, limped into Malta that morning, her bow smashed by torpedo damage but her cargo intact. That made 4 ships delivered from the original 14. 4 ships was not enough. Without Ohio's fuel, those 4 ships might as well have been sunk. Malta's Spitfires couldn't fly without fuel. The submarines couldn't sortie without fuel. The island would fall without fuel. At noon, German bombers found Ohio again, 20 Ju-88s, their pilots determined to finish what had been started 2 days earlier. They came in high and fast, and the guns on Penn and Ledbury threw up everything they had. Ohio couldn't shoot anymore. Her gun crews were exhausted, her ammunition largely expended, her fire control systems wrecked. The bombs fell in a pattern that surrounded the tanker with geysers of white water. One struck the same location the first torpedo had hit, blowing the damage open wider, the explosion echoing across the water. Ohio's keel broke completely. The tanker's back snapped, her bow and stern sagging downward, held together only by the side plating and deck plates. By every law of physics and naval architecture, she should have broken in half and sunk immediately. But she didn't. Somehow, impossibly, Ohio held together. The side plating, stressed beyond any design limit, simply refused to tear. The deck plates, buckled and warped, maintained enough integrity to keep the 2 halves connected, and the fuel in her tanks provided buoyancy, keeping her afloat even as water flooded every open space. The tow had broken in the attack, the heavy Manila line parting under the strain. Ohio wallowed dead in the water again, her engines finally giving up, her rudder jammed hard over, turning lazy circles in the current. It seemed like the end. After 4 days of fighting, after surviving torpedoes and bombs and fire and collisions, Ohio was finally beaten. But Penn's captain refused to accept defeat. He brought his destroyer alongside Ohio's port side, lashing the 2 ships together with every line and cable they could find. Ledbury did the same on the starboard side, creating a bizarre 3-ship amalgamation that looked like something from a fever dream. The destroyers would provide propulsion, steering, and buoyancy. Ohio would simply hang between them, a broken ship carried by her escorts. It shouldn't have worked. The physics were absurd, but it did work, and at 3 p.m. on August 14th, the strange convoy began moving again at 3 knots. 3 knots toward Malta. 3 knots toward survival. Through the afternoon and evening they crawled eastward. Spitfires from Malta flew constant cover, their pilots nursing their fuel, landing, refueling, and taking off again to protect the wounded tanker. Axis aircraft appeared several times, but were driven off by the fighters and the combined anti-aircraft fire of the destroyers. As night fell, they were 20 miles from Malta. Close enough to see the island's searchlights sweeping the sky. Close enough to hear, faintly over the sound of the engines, the distant rumble of explosions as Axis bombers attacked the airfields, trying to prevent the Spitfires from flying. August 15th was the feast of Santa Maria, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, the most important religious holiday in Malta's calendar. It would also be the day Ohio entered Grand Harbor, or died trying. Dawn found them 10 miles out, close enough to make out individual buildings on Malta's coast, close enough to see the massive fortifications of Valletta that had withstood sieges since the time of the Knights of St. John. The morning was perfect, the Mediterranean glassy calm, the sky clear and blue, as if God himself had decreed that this day would be blessed. At 8 a.m., a final attack developed. German bombers made one last attempt to sink the tanker that had survived everything they'd thrown at her. But now Malta's entire fighter strength was overhead, 24 Spitfires flying top cover, their pilots grim and determined. No German bomber would get through. Not today, not this close. At 9:30 a.m., escorted by Penn and Ledbury, supported by the minesweeper Rye, protected by Spitfires overhead, the SS Ohio entered Grand Harbor. The destroyer Bramham had joined them during the night, and now all 4 escorts shepherded the broken tanker through the harbor entrance, past the ancient fortifications, into the protected waters that had been her destination since leaving Scotland 2 weeks earlier. The waterfronts were lined with people. Thousands of Maltese civilians and servicemen stood in silence as Ohio passed. This ship that had refused to die, this symbol of Britain's determination to hold Malta at any cost. Men removed their hats, women crossed themselves, some wept openly, understanding that this shattered hulk of metal represented their survival. As Ohio approached her berth, the crowd began to cheer, a sound that grew and grew until it echoed off the limestone walls of the harbor. A military band played Rule Britannia, the music thin and brave in the morning air. The crew of Ohio, exhausted men who hadn't slept in 4 days, stood on their ship's deck and waved, too tired to do more than smile. Fleet oilers and tankers immediately came alongside. Hoses were connected to Ohio's cargo tanks, and pumps began transferring the precious fuel. The tanker was sinking beneath them, settling lower with each passing hour, her broken back finally giving way. But the fuel was flowing, and that was all that mattered. They pumped through the day and into the night, working without pause, knowing that every gallon mattered. As the last of the fuel left Ohio's tanks, her keel touched bottom. She settled onto the harbor floor, her back broken in 2, held together only by will and the grace of God. The 2 halves of the tanker sat on the bottom of Grand Harbor, split but unbeaten, having delivered her cargo. Captain Dudley Mason and his crew were evacuated to shore, many of them with burns and injuries that required immediate medical attention. Mason himself had been burned when the Stuka crashed into his ship, and he was flown back to England for treatment. On September 8, 1942, King George VI awarded him the George Cross, Britain's highest honor for civilian bravery. The citation read, "The ship was a focus of attack throughout. Although twice torpedoed and frequently near missed from the air, her master, by his consummate courage, skill, and devotion to duty, brought his ship into harbor. Throughout, he showed skill and courage of the highest order, and it was due to his determination that, in spite of the most persistent enemy opposition, the vessel, with her valuable cargo, eventually reached Malta." 23 other members of Ohio's crew received decorations, from the Distinguished Service Order to Distinguished Service Medals. Every man who served aboard that ship during Operation Pedestal earned recognition, though not all survived to receive it. The fuel from Ohio, combined with the supplies from the other 4 merchant ships that reached Malta, was just enough. The RAF could now mount unlimited combat sorties for 2 months. Submarine operations resumed from Malta's harbors. By September, Malta-based aircraft and submarines were sinking Axis shipping at a rate that strangled Rommel's supply lines. In that month alone, Allied forces sank 100,000 tons of Axis shipping, including 24,000 tons of fuel destined for the Africa Corps. Rommel launched his assault at El Alamein in October 1942, desperately short of fuel and ammunition. The British Eighth Army, fully supplied and reinforced, stopped him cold and then counterattacked. By November, the Africa Corps was in full retreat, and in that same month, American forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch. The campaign that would drive the Axis from Africa completely had begun, and it began because Malta survived. The cost of Operation Pedestal had been staggering. 9 of the 14 merchant ships were sunk. The aircraft carrier Eagle, the cruisers Cairo and Manchester, the destroyer Foresight, all sent to the bottom. The carrier Indomitable heavily damaged. Over 500 sailors and merchant seamen killed. The losses were so severe that the Admiralty couldn't risk another convoy on that scale. Malta wouldn't be fully resupplied until November, after El Alamein, when the recapture of Libyan airfields made convoy escort possible from land-based aircraft. But 5 ships got through. 5 ships delivered 32,000 tons of supplies, and Ohio delivered 10,000 tons of fuel. For Malta, starving and desperate, it was enough. Barely, impossibly, miraculously enough. After the war, Ohio's hulk was raised and used for storage, then as barracks for Yugoslav troops. In 1946, her 2 sections were towed out to sea separately and scuttled. A few pieces remain in Maltese museums, rusted reminders of the ship that refused to die. Every August 15th, Malta celebrates the Feast of Santa Maria, and the celebration includes remembrance of the convoy that saved them, the Santa Maria Convoy, Operation Pedestal. The strategic implications of Operation Pedestal extended far beyond Malta's immediate survival. With Malta operational as an offensive base, the balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted decisively. German and Italian convoys to North Africa had to take longer routes around Malta's operational radius, increasing transit time and exposure to attack. Axis shipping losses increased from 40% to over 70% by late 1942. Field Marshal Rommel, conducting his desert campaign while starved of supplies, wrote in his diary, "Without Malta, the Axis will end by losing control of North Africa." He was proven correct. Malta survived, and 6 months later, the Africa Corps surrendered in Tunisia, 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marching into captivity. The human dimension of Operation Pedestal transcends strategic analysis. Captain Mason's decision to go back aboard Ohio when every instinct screamed at him to abandon ship and save himself. Commander Swain's determination to tow a vessel 10 times his destroyer's weight because Malta needed that fuel. The gunners who stood at their stations while Stukas screamed down at them. The engineers who coaxed broken machinery to life while their ship was literally breaking apart beneath them. The fighter pilots who flew sortie after sortie until they were too exhausted to climb out of their cockpits. The Maltese civilians who endured starvation and bombing for years because they refused to surrender. These were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, who chose courage over comfort, duty over survival. They weren't supermen, they were scared, they wanted to live, but they understood that some things mattered more than individual survival. Malta mattered, the war effort mattered, their shipmates mattered, and so they stood their ground and fought and died if necessary, because that's what the moment demanded. In 1985, at a reunion of Allied and Axis veterans, a former Luftwaffe pilot who'd attacked the Pedestal convoy was asked what he remembered about the operation. His answer was simple and devastating. The tanker. We hit her so many times. Torpedoes, bombs, a crashed aircraft. She should have exploded a dozen times over, but she kept moving. We couldn't believe it. In the Luftwaffe, we started calling her Der Geistertanker, the ghost tanker. Nothing killed her. That same reunion featured Captain Mason, now an elderly man, standing beside former enemies who'd tried to kill him 43 years earlier. When asked how Ohio survived, Mason's answer reflected the humility that characterized the men of his generation. We survived because we had to. Malta needed fuel, so we delivered fuel. It's as simple as that. It wasn't simple, of course. Nothing about Operation Pedestal was simple. It was brutal and desperate and horrifying, a passage through hell that cost hundreds of lives and nearly failed a dozen times over. But it succeeded because men like Dudley Mason refused to accept failure. The legacy of Operation Pedestal extends into the present day. The George Cross awarded to Malta appears on the Maltese flag, a permanent reminder of the island's courage during the siege. Maltese schoolchildren learn about the Santa Maria Convoy, about the ships that fought through impossible odds to save them. The story of Ohio and Captain Mason is taught as an example of duty and determination, of refusing to quit even when quitting seems like the only rational choice. In Britain, Operation Pedestal is remembered as one of the Royal Navy's finest hours, proof that courage and determination can overcome apparently insurmountable odds. Naval officers study the operation as an example of convoy defense, learning from both the successes and the failures. The decision to strip the home fleet to provide heavy escort, the timing of the operation to allow maximum air cover, the tactical choices made by commanders at sea, all provide lessons for modern naval warfare. For Malta, Operation Pedestal represents the turning point of the siege, the moment when defeat transformed into survival and ultimately victory. Before Pedestal, Malta was on the verge of surrender, 3 weeks from starvation, unable to sustain offensive operations. After Pedestal, Malta became the offensive base that strangled Axis supply lines and contributed directly to victory in North Africa. The mathematics were brutal but simple. Malta needed 10,000 tons of fuel to survive. Ohio carried 10,000 tons of fuel. Ohio delivered that fuel despite being torpedoed, bombed, crashed into, and broken in half. Therefore, Malta survived. From Malta's survival came Rommel's defeat. From Rommel's defeat came the invasion of Sicily and Italy. The chain of causation extends from one American-built tanker with a British crew all the way to the eventual Allied victory in Europe. History tends to focus on the great battles, the massive campaigns, the decisive moments involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But sometimes history turns on smaller pivots. Sometimes the fate of campaigns depends on a single ship making it through. Operation Pedestal was one of those moments, a desperate gamble that succeeded by the narrowest of margins, saved by the courage of men who refused to let a broken ship die. Captain Dudley Mason died in 1987 at the age of 85. His George Cross is displayed at the Imperial War Museum in London. The citation accompanying it tells the official story of his heroism, but the real story exists in the hundreds of sailors and airmen who survived because Malta remained operational, in the thousands of Axis soldiers who died because their supply convoys were sunk by Malta-based forces, in the strategic victory in North Africa that began with one damaged tanker refusing to sink. On August 15th each year, in the Grand Harbor at Valletta, a ceremony commemorates the arrival of the Santa Maria Convoy. A wreath is laid in the water where Ohio finally gave up and settled to the bottom, her cargo delivered, her duty done. Veterans attend when they can, though their numbers diminish with each passing year. The people of Malta remember, because they understand that their freedom, their survival, their very existence as an independent nation was purchased with the lives and courage of men like those who brought Ohio through. The SS Ohio never sailed again. She couldn't. She was broken, beyond repair, split in two, useful only as a source of scrap metal once her fuel was pumped out. But her legacy sailed on every ship, in every convoy, in every desperate operation, where courage mattered more than firepower. Her story became legend, the ship that refused to die, the tanker that saved an island and changed the course of a war. If you found this story of courage and determination compelling, of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things under impossible circumstances, please like this video and subscribe to Warfile. These are the stories history forgets but must remember. The human dimension of war that transcends tactics and strategy and touches the core of what it means to face fear and choose courage anyway. Comment below with your thoughts on Operation Pedestal, on the men who fought through to Malta, on what you would have done in Captain Mason's position when every instinct screamed to abandon ship and save yourself.